Welcome to Dig, a history podcast. Today we're going to explore one of Texas's most enduring legends, the story of the Yellow Rose of Texas and her supposed role in the Battle of San Jacinto. In the winter of 1835, a mixed-race woman was working as a domestic servant in New Washington, later known as Morgan's Point, a small settlement in Texas. In mid-April 1836, weeks after laying siege to and defeating a small group of rebellious Texans at the Alamo, Mexican troops commanded by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna arrived at New Washington. After looting and burning the settlement, Santa Anna and his soldiers captured Emily and forced her and other captives to travel with the Mexican army.
According to legend, Emily was in Santa Anna's tent on April 21st when Sam Houston's Texan army surprised Santa Anna's troops, charging the Mexican camp in what came to be known as the Battle of San Jacinto. The Texans took hundreds of prisoners, Santa Anna included, who soon after secured his freedom by signing a treaty recognizing Texas's independence.
The myth claims that Emily was deliberately acting as a spy for the Texian cause. By seducing and distracting Santa Anna in his tent, she supposedly prevented the Mexican general from organizing an effective defense when Houston's forces charged the Mexican camp. Her romantic entanglement with the enemy commander allegedly gave the Texans the element of surprise they needed to achieve their stunning 18-minute victory, which secured Texas independence from Mexico.
This myth maintains Emily was enslaved to Texian Colonel James Morgan and that she heroically sacrificed herself for the cause of Texas freedom. And Emily is supposedly the inspiration for the song, The Yellow Rose of Texas.
However, almost none of this is true. So today, we are going to unravel the myth of the Yellow Rose of Texas. We will explore the woman at the heart of the tale, Emily D. West, who was a free woman of color working in Texas, and untangle her real-life story from the Texan myth. We will also unravel how Emily's tale was erroneously tied to the song, The Yellow Rose of Texas. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We are so thankful for all of our Patreon supporters, but especially our auger and excavator level patrons. That is Carl, Alyssa, Maria, Colin, Denise, Edward, Jesse, Judy, Karen, Lauren, Lisa, Megan, and Susan. We can't thank you enough. Listener, if you enjoy what we do here, but you aren't yet a patron of this show, it is easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
So as a child growing up in Texas, I learned this myth about Emily Morgan and her connection to the song The Yellow Rose of Texas. Recently, I was in San Antonio, Texas at the Alamo, and they have erected a statue of Emily in the courtyard at the Alamo. Although it erroneously gives her name as Emily West Morgan when her name was actually Emily D. West, the statue does attempt to set the record straight regarding Emily's free status and the nebulous origins of her story and the song, The Yellow Rose of Texas. And while we were standing there reading the placard on this statue, my sister was with me, and she kind of offhandedly said there were many roses. She went on to say that many Black and mixed race women were referred to as roses at the time. Now, I had never heard this, and I also hadn't given much thought to Emily's story and her role in the Battle of San Jacinto since I had learned this myth in this song as an elementary student. And so, dear listener, this episode is a reflection of me trying to parse out this story and determine what is true and what is part of a long history of American myth-making. This episode, as with all of our episodes, relies on the work of other scholars and historians who have uncovered Emily's true story, as well as scholars working on race, gender, and state building in the 19th century, including Jeff Dunn, Emily Clark, Daniel Livesey, Obagale Lake, Trudier Harris, Andrew Torget, Francis Edward Abernathy, and James Lutzweiler.
The woman at the heart of the story was Emily D. West, a free mixed race and, because of the one drop rule, Black woman born in New Haven, Connecticut. In October 1835, she signed a legitimate employment contract with James Morgan in New York City to work as a housekeeper for 1 year at the New Washington Association's hotel in Texas for $100 per year plus transportation.
The New Washington Association was a business venture formed in 1834 by a group of New York investors whose goal was to build a town at the tip of Galveston Bay, at a place where they can control the San Jacinto River, a major thoroughfare on the growing Texas coast. The New York investors made James Morgan their agent and manager for the project. The investors bought 2 small schooners to transport goods and passengers to New Washington, later called Morgan's Point, and sent workmen to build a hotel and warehouses for goods traveling along the San Jacinto and Galveston Bay.
Emily arrived in Texas in December 1835 as a free woman, traveling alongside other workers and settlers, including the well-off Emily di Zavala, the wife of Lorenzo di Zavala, who was one of the New York investors.
Texas in 1835 was an unstable place, and anxieties over race were threatening a war. So for a little backstory, slavery was allowed in New Spain, meaning land that includes present-day Central America north of Panama, Mexico, the U.S. Southwest, and parts of the Philippines and Caribbean islands that were controlled by colonial Spain.
Mexico, like many other South American colonies during the 19th century, fought its own war of independence against Spain and won. The Mexican national period in the Tejas region lasted from 1821 until Texas independence in 1836. That time period represents the greatest shift in the early history of slavery in Texas.
The region that would become Texas was sparsely populated, and slavery in Texas did not follow the American South's chattel slavery model until white American settlers began to migrate into the region in larger numbers during the 1820s. Mexico attempted to develop the region of northern Mexico that we now know as Central and South Texas by offering land grants to Americans in exchange for bringing settlers to bolster the population in the area.
In 1821, the same year of Mexican independence, Mexico granted a Connecticut farmer named Moses Austin, and later his son, Stephen F. Austin, permission to colonize the Texas region of Mexico with American farmers. The Austins received a large land grant and then resold smaller tracts of land to American settlers. To become a settler in the Mexican territory, settlers had to be of good moral character, become Mexican citizens, and practice Catholicism. Few settlers, though, followed those rules.
Following Mexican independence in 1821, the Mexican government adopted policies to gradually outlaw enslavement in the newly established country. But Anglo settlers actively worked to ensure slavery was preserved in Texas. Stephen F. Austin negotiated a policy with officials in Mexico in regard to slavery. For each slave that an immigrant brought with them, they would be allowed to purchase an additional 50 acres of land. And this later increased to 80 acres of land, because Austin knew that the only way that he could attract settlers would be if they could also bring their slaves.
Most white Americans willing to emigrate to Texas did so because of the opportunity to get cheap land and to begin making money by producing cotton. And unfortunately, the only way to grow cotton profitably required slaves. Stephen F. Austin made this clear in 1824, writing, quote, "The principal product that will elevate us from poverty is cotton, and we cannot do this without the help of slaves." End quote. Now, obviously, cotton can be grown without slaves. Settlers just believed that they couldn't grow cotton profitably without slaves because large plantations in the southeastern United States relied on slave labor, and competing against those cotton producers with wage labor would have been futile.
A number of enslaved Black people arrived with Stephen F. Austin and his Angler settlers in 1824. By the end of 1825, there were around 443 slaves in the colony, roughly a quarter of the Austin colony's population. By the time that clashes with the Mexican government led to the Texas Revolution in 1836, more than 5,000 enslaved people lived in Texas.
However, Mexico would grant free blacks in Texas full Mexican citizenship and property rights. Many free blacks and escaped slaves went to Texas early in the 19th century, where they received some semblance of equality, on paper at least. Historian Andrew Torget's book, Seeds of Empire, opens with an anecdote highlighting the nebulous state of free and enslaved Black people in Texas during the 1820s and 1830s.
Now, the story written in most histories about Texas's first American settlers begins like this. On Moses Austin's first trip to Texas, where he asked for and received permission to bring settlers to Texas, he crossed paths with a planter from Louisiana named James Kirkham.
This part of Austin's journey is retold in histories about the beginnings of Texas independence and the Austins because Kirkham stole Austin's horses and provisions in the middle of the night. Austin was traveling with his son's slave named Richmond, so Richmond and Austin had to travel by foot in the middle of January. Austin ended up getting pneumonia, and although he made it back home, he died just a few weeks later. So that's why his son, Stephen F. Austin, took over the settlement of Texas and later became one of the major players in Texas independence.
But what's missing from this story, and I had actually never known this until I read Torget's book, was that Kirkham was in Texas because he was chasing 3 of his slaves named Marion, Richard, and Teavee, who had escaped and run to Mexico for their freedom. And just FYI, they made it. They actually ended up living out their lives as Mexican citizens, by the way. But
wow.
so yeah, but it's interesting though, because this founder, the story of the founder of what we now know as American Texas, right, began on this journey with 2 slaveholders, so Austin and Kirkham, and 4 enslaved people, 3 of which were running to Mexico to emancipate themselves. And so that's kind of the part that's usually left out of this story.
Yeah, wow. In 1827, Mexico outlawed the introduction of additional slaves and granted freedom at birth to all children born to slaves. Within a year, however, the state Congress of Coahuila and Texas passed a law that allowed slave owners to bring indentured servants to the region. So, slave owners simply had their slaves sign contracts of long-term indenture to their masters. Mexico fully abolished slavery in 1829, as well as additional immigration to Texas from the United States. Mexico made an exception for the Austin colony, however, and more white Americans came into the state accompanied by their slave laborers. I'm so grateful for this episode right now because I talk about this when I teach 161, but I talk about it so briefly. I'm a bunch of white Americans were moving to Texas, So
Yeah.
I'm glad to have this more detailed. And the way that you write it out is so straightforward that I've tried to wrap my head around the law, how the laws changed, and it's always confused me. So this is helpful.
Oh, good. Because, I mean, honestly, I still get confused, too. I know last semester I was teaching in Latinx class and talking about how Mexico had basically cut off any immigration from the United States because they were like, y'all are crazy. Y'all
Right.
can't come in anymore. But then, I'm looking closer and I'm like, oh, but the Austin colony was still allowed in. So there are all these basically loopholes going on. But I also,
Right.
when I would teach 161, I would also teach or kind of include this in the idea of Mississippi fever, right? Because
Yes.
this is really the extension of the cotton belt, right?
Exactly. Right.
and-
That's the context in which I talk about it too.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. All right. So let's see, where are we? Okay, so essentially from 1821 to 1836, the Mexican government threatened to restrict or end slavery. They passed laws to do so, but they always allowed some sort of out or loophole for Texas settlers. So although the Mexican government continually made exceptions for Texas in regards to slavery, many slaveholders in Texas worried that Mexico might at some time attempt to actually uphold the laws of the land and abolish slavery for good in the region. American immigrants in Texas had a lot of money invested in cotton production and thus slavery, and they did not want to see those investments put at stake. Furthermore, the Mexican government began centralizing all authority in Mexico City instead of dispersed regional government seats as it had been before. And so this further enraged the Texans, who felt that their voices were not being heard with a government that was now so far away from them back in Mexico City.
In March 1836, the Texas government assembled in a city called Washington on the Brazos and began writing a constitution for an independent Texas. One of the laws written in the general provisions of the Constitution of the Republic of Texas stated, quote, "All persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude. Congress shall pass no laws to prohibit immigrants from bringing their slaves into the Republic with them and holding them by the same tenure by which such slaves were held in the United States. Nor shall Congress have power to emancipate slaves, nor shall any slaveholder be allowed to emancipate his or her slave without the consent of Congress, unless he or she shall send his or her slave or slaves without the limits of the Republic."
Okay,
that's
a lot, right?
Fascinating. It's a lot. Yeah.
In plain language, right? The Texans are stating their Declaration of Independence from Mexico, and they are making sure that slavery was one of the core tenets of the new Texas Constitution. And they are saying that if you so choose to free your slaves, you have to send them out of the Republic of Texas. They cannot stay here anymore.
Right. Yeah, what stands out to me there is like they sort of are doing in short form the like many of the laws that we see happening over a long period of time in other states, like those that clause about like you can't emancipate your own slave without the consent of Congress unless you send them out of state. Like those manumission laws you see develop over a long period of time in various states like Virginia and whatever. So it's really interesting that the Texans are like, okay, we learned from all of that. Now let's implement it.
Right. From just off the bat. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, Emily, remember Emily?
Emily.
Emily arrived in Texas just a few short months before the Texas Declaration of Independence and the start of the war between Texas and Mexico. She arrived in December 1835, and the Alamo fell in March 1836. So she's landing right in the middle of things.
Right. So, yeah, Texas is a fairly unstable place when Emily D. West arrives. And so this is where I started to kind of get into some rabbit holes, so to speak. I was really like wondering, like, what on earth is Emily D. West thinking and doing during all of this time, right? So my first question is, why did she sign a labor contract with Morgan and consent to travel from New York to Texas to work for him, being a mixed race woman, right?
Right.
And this is honestly where I come up with more questions than I do answers. I don't know why she signed it. Did she sign the contract with Morgan and head to Texas for work because she thought that Mexico would protect her freedom as a mixed race woman? I mean, she did, after all, sign her contract in 1835, and Mexican law at that time had legal protections for Black people. It's before the Texas, Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. Another kind of plausibility was she just so desperate for work that she needed any job available. But again, this seems negligible. There were plenty of opportunities to do domestic work in the Northeast. She didn't have to travel all the way to Texas to find a domestic service job, right? And the money that she was getting, $100 a year, so roughly works out to about $1.90 a week, was not a especially generous salary at the time. It was okay, but it wasn't anything to go to Texas over, right? Did Emily perhaps know some of the people from the New Washington Association and so felt safe traveling to another country with them, even though it was Anglos who were set on Americanizing the area? Literally, we don't know. And hopefully, there's more research being done on this. I mean, I'm kind of intrigued, so maybe I'll start diving into the archives a little more. But from what I can tell, we just
Right.
have a few moments where Emily actually shows up in the archives. And so we really just don't know why she decided to sign this labor contract and go to Texas in
Yeah.
1835.
Yeah. Yeah. Either way, 4 months into Emily's contract, Mexican forces arrived at New Washington. James Morgan had joined the Texans and was commanding Fort Travis in Galveston, and so he wasn't at New Washington when Mexican forces arrived.
The Mexicans were pursuing the president of Texas, David G. Burnett, who escaped. Mexican forces seized Emily West along with others from Morgan's warehouse. When General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna arrived the next day, he ordered the buildings to be burned and departed to confront Sam Houston's army. Emily and others in New Washington were taken captive and forced to accompany the Mexican army.
Emily's legend develops from here. According to Texas myth, during the decisive Battle of San Jacinto on April 21st, 1836, a beautiful young enslaved woman named Emily Morgan played a crucial role in Texas's victory over Mexico. The story goes that this quote-unquote mulatto woman was in Mexican General Santa Anna's tent at the critical moment when Sam Houston's Texian army launched their surprise attack.
The myth claims that Emily Morgan was deliberately acting as a spy for the Texian cause. By seducing and distracting Santa Anna in his tent, she supposedly prevented the Mexican general from organizing an effective defense when Houston's forces charged the Mexican camp. Her romantic entanglement with the enemy commander allegedly gave the Texans the element of surprise they needed to achieve their 18-minute victory, which secured Texas independence from Mexico. This story maintains that Emily was a slave belonging to Colonel James Morgan, and that she heroically sacrificed herself for the cause of Texas freedom by seducing the Mexican general on behalf of Texans, one of which owned her.
If Emily was indeed in Santa Anna's camp, the historical reality is far grimmer than the romantic legend suggests. As a woman, prisoner of war, she would more likely have been a victim of sexual assault than a willing seductress. The myth transforms a probable victim into a willing participant, obscuring the real experiences of women during wartime.
The legend perpetuates harmful stereotypes about women of color while erasing Emily's true identity as a free woman with agency. Storytellers assumed she was James Morgan's slave simply because she was black, revealing the racist assumptions of both the 1830s and the 20th century mythmakers. Furthermore, the fact that she is sexually associated with Santa Anna highlights 19th and 20th century mythology about women of color as sexual objects for the pleasure of white men.
This romanticization reflects broader patterns in how American culture has mythologized mixed-race women. As historian Emily Clark demonstrates in her analysis of New Orleans and the mystique of the New Orleans quadroon, she argues that 19th century travel writers, fiction writers, and abolitionists developed false narratives that located the quote-unquote exotic mixed-race woman in specific places like New Orleans, quote, where one could encounter beautiful women produced by a specific degree of procreation across the color line, women whose sexual favors were reserved for white men. The reality, of course, was more complicated than that. Women whose racial ancestry would have earned them the color term quadroon lived everywhere in 19th century America, end quote.
Clark argues the quadroon culture of New Orleans was actually a result of Haitian immigration and practical circumstances, the lack of suitable marriage partners among free people of color, which encouraged relationships with white men who had flooded into the expanding city. Most surprisingly, Clark discovered that plissage, the term now commonly used to describe relationships between antebellum mixed-race women and white men, wasn't even used in antebellum New Orleans. It was a later invention that had been quote, picked up and repeated endlessly by writers of all kinds, along with concepts like the tragic mulatto of abolitionist literature and the exotic mulâtresse of the supposedly glamorous quadroon balls. Eventually, the mythology was exploited by those promoting prostitution, who sought out light-skinned enslaved women to sell as fancy girls to men wanting to live out fantasies of the wealthy slave owner with an expensive mistress.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Seen in this context, it is not surprising that Emily's story changed her free status. In the myth, she is Emily Morgan, slave of James Morgan, and a mixed-race seductress, sometimes of partial Mexican ancestry as well, who uses her sexual wiles as a light-skinned woman to ensnare the white Santa Anna on behalf of her white enslavers. In the myth, she is an exotic, sexualized figure in the quote-unquote foreign borderlands of Texas, rather than recognizing the reality of free Black women like Emily D. West, who lived and worked all throughout the United States.
So, also, what about this idea floating around that mixed-race women were known as roses? Referring to women as roses was commonplace in the 19th century. This literary usage coincided with the peak of floriography, or the language of flowers, where flowers carried coded meaning in Victorian culture. Roses specifically symbolized love and beauty, but also purity and virtue, creating complex and sometimes contradictory meanings when applied to mixed-race women. White flowers, like white roses, were associated with purity and virtue, while darker or mixed flowers could represent racial mixing. The floral terminology in literature served multiple functions, romanticizing the harsh realities of slavery and racial oppression, creating exotic otherness through aestheticized descriptions, and reinforcing the quote-unquote tragic mulatto stereotype by linking beauty with inevitable doom.
In England and parts of North America, the beauty standard was to be a quote-unquote English rose, meaning a woman with pink cheeks and red lips and pale skin. Dan Livesey chronicles anxieties over complexion in England in his book Children of Uncertain Fortune, which traced rich white Jamaican families that sent their mixed-race children to England to live in a free society, but found that racial anxieties trumped class. Anxieties about complexion were evident throughout the West, as evidenced by elaborate sunshades, bonnets, and the use of harsh exfoliants to keep the skin as light as possible. In regard to Emily's story and the idea that mixed-race women were specifically called roses, the more accurate portrayal is that young women of all races were referred to as roses in literature and song. Whatever the shade of the rose, it referred to a young woman's bloom of beauty and youth. White supremacist patriarchy determined whether the bloom, or young woman, was worthy of being protected and adored or plucked for white men's pleasure.
So back to Emily being a key player in the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna's officers made no reference to any woman in their formal reports upon their return to Mexico, even though many were severely critical of their commander's conduct. So had such a compromising situation actually taken place, Santa Anna's numerous political adversaries would have undoubtedly exploited it for their own purposes. Similarly, official Texan military accounts of the Battle of San Jacinto contain no records of discovering a woman in Santa Anna's quarters or tent or arms or anything like that.
The only written reference to anything resembling this story comes from British traveler William Ballard, who traveled throughout Texas in 1842 and 1843. His travel writings document a conversation he had with an unnamed veteran of the Texan War. Apparently, the Texan told Ballard that, quote, the Battle of San Jacinto was probably lost to the Mexicans owing to the influence of a mulatta girl, Emily, belonging to Colonel Morgan, who was closeted in the tent with General Santana. This was secondhand information from an unidentified source recorded 6 years after the battle. These travel logs were not published during Ballard's lifetime. They eventually wound up in the archives at the Newberry Library in Chicago.
In reality, following the Mexican army's defeat at San Jacinto, Emily West gained her freedom. In 1837, she approached Isaac in Moreland, an artillery officer who would later serve as a county judge in Houston, requesting a passport for her return to New York. Moreland contacted the Texas Secretary of State, describing Emily as a 36-year-old free woman who had arrived in Texas in 1835 alongside Colonel Morgan and whose free papers had been lost during the Battle of San Jacinto. And this marks Emily D. West's final appearance in historical documentation, presumably having made her way back to the Northeast at the earliest opportunity possible, and perhaps with help from Emily de Zavala, who was also hightailing it out of Texas and back to New York at the same time. It's completely understandable why somebody like Emily West would want out of Texas, because once Texas had declared independence, they outlawed free blacks within the borders of the new nation. And you'll also remember that Texas doesn't even enter the Union until 1845. So it's basically at that point just the Republic of Texas.
So how was Emily's myth created, and how did she turn into the Yellow Rose of Texas? The legend remained largely forgotten for more than a century before two journalists embellished upon it during the 1950s and 60s. Henderson Shuffler, which is a fantastic name, Henderson Shuffler, who worked as a publicist at Texas A&M University and subsequently became the inaugural director of San Antonio's Institute of Texan Cultures, believed that the San Jacinto heroine, then already a myth, deserved her own musical tribute. He intentionally linked Emily's narrative to the well-known and pre-existing 1850s minstrel tune, The Yellow Rose of Texas, forging a historical connection that had never actually existed before this. In a 1960s correspondence, Shuffler candidly acknowledged that regardless of whether such a connection was factual, it should be created.
Shuffler concocted the connection himself, and then Dallas Morning News columnist Frank X. Tolbert took up the story, describing Emily as a, quote, decorative, long-haired mulatto girl, Latin-looking woman of about 20, despite having absolutely no documentation for this description.
The song, The Yellow Rose of Texas, was first published in 1853 in Christie's Plantation Melodies No. 2, a songbook for a blackface minstrel show known as Christie's Minstrels. Minstrel shows were usually white people dressed in blackface, singing songs that they imagined black people would sing. The original lyrics to The Yellow Rose of Texas depicted an African-American singer who refers to himself as a quote-unquote darky and longs to return to a quote-unquote yellow girl. Here, yellow was a term used to describe mixed-race women with light skin. It's actually a term you see really often in the 19th century.
Absolutely, yeah. And even in the 20th century, too.
Oh, sure.
In 1858, the lyrics were updated from yellow girl to yellow rose. And so that's the first time that we see rose in this song. So I'm going to say the lyrics of the 1858 song. Again, these are words and vernacular from the time, and in no shape, way, or form would we ever advocate using these words at any other time but to read a historical document, right? All right, so these are the words to the 1858 song. So there's a yellow rose in Texas that I'm going to see. No other darky knows her, no darky, only me. She cried so when I left her, it like to broke my heart. And if I ever find her, we never more will part. She's the sweetest rose of color this darky ever knew. Her eyes are bright as diamonds, they sparkle like the dew. You may talk about your dearest May and sing of Rosalie, but the yellow rose of Texas beats the bells of Tennessee.
The song was very popular throughout the 19th century. The Yellow Rose of Texas was a popular marching song for Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. In this version, they replaced quote-unquote darky with soldier.
The song's original references to race were gradually removed, transforming it into what appeared to be a racially neutral love ballad while completely obscuring its origins in blackface minstrelsy. In 1933, Gene Autry and Jimmy Long adopted the song for country and Western audiences, modifying the racially explicit language to make it more commercially acceptable for mainstream white audiences. quote-unquote darky was replaced with fellow. Roy Rogers later featured a version of the song in his 1944 film, The Yellow Rose of Texas. Mitch Miller recorded the song for Columbia Records in 1955, replacing Rose of Color with Rosebud, and it became #1 on the Billboard charts for 6 weeks. Ernie Tubb recorded the song in the same year and topped the country western charts.
But the enduringly popular song never had any connection to San Jacinto, Santa Ana, or to a woman named Emily West. That was all created by Shuffler and Tolbert in the 1960s. But they did not concoct the story entirely out of thin air.
Englishman William Bollart's travel diaries, collected during his trip to Texas in 1842-1843, were never commercially published, but they were held at the Newberry Library in Chicago, as we mentioned earlier. In 1946, Joe France, in his PhD dissertation at the University of Texas, and subsequently in his published version of his dissertation, mentioned Bollart's claim that Emily, a mixed-race woman, sexually distracted Santa Ana before the Battle of San Jacinto. W. Eugene Holland and Ruth Lamphin Butler transcribed Bollart's papers into the book William Bollart's Texas in 1956. They also mentioned the Emily story, but only in a footnote.
This is where Shuffler and Tolbert enter the story, picking up on the connection between Emily and the Battle of San Jacinto and running with it. Tolbert went so far as to claim that, quote, one set of original lyrics from the song named the girl in the song, quote, Emily, the maid of Morgan's Point. Morgan's Point being the area that the New Washington Association was trying to build up. There has never been any documented proof of this connection.
In 1976, Martha Ann Turner, a Texas history author and English professor at Sam Houston State University, wrote a book, The Yellow Rose of Texas, Her Saga and Her Song. In this book and other articles, Turner accepted the connection between Emily West, Emily Morgan, and the song The Yellow Rose of Texas uncritically, citing Tolbert as her only evidence of the connection. By the 1980s, the myth had become so entrenched that it was treated as historical fact. Margaret S. Hinson was one of the most outspoken historians who attempted to raise an awareness of their flawed analysis and exaggerations, but the link between Emily and the song continued unabated in popular literature.
The story gained renewed popularity during the Texas sesquicentennial in 1986.
And this is where baby Elizabeth, myself, learned the story. The Texas sesquicentennial was a huge celebration. I still remember it vividly. I mean, there was like just all kinds of celebrations and parades and everything like that. And I think we sang the Yellow Rose of Texas in music class like literally every day that school year, right? Simultaneously, James Michener's best-selling doorstop of a novel, Texas, further entrenched Emily's myth and her nebulous connection to the song, writing, quote, immortality was visited upon the least likely participant of the battle. Emily Morgan, who had diverted Santa Ana's attention that hot afternoon just before the charge of the Texicans, became celebrated in song as the Yellow Rose of Texas, and few who sing it in romantic settings realize they are serenading the memory of a mulatto slave, end quote. According to scholar Jeff Dunn, the connection between Emily Morgan and the song was being made as late as 2011 in the Handbook of Texas Online, which is actually a really good digital source for Texas history, by the way.
So are we just like a buzzkill? Some might argue that debunking the Yellow Rose legend is unnecessarily destructive, that we're removing a heroic woman from Texas history and diminishing an inspiring tale of courage and sacrifice. But this perspective misses a crucial point. We're not removing a heroic woman from history. We're probing a myth that hides the exploitative elements of 19th century race and the horrors of war.
The romanticized legend does more than distort historical facts. It actively perpetuates harm by masking the brutal realities of 19th century racial exploitation and the violence of war, especially against women facing the constant threat of rape and forced sexual bondage. When we repeat stories that reimagine probable victims of sexual assault as cunning temptresses, we reinforce the same cultural mechanisms that Emily Clark identified in New Orleans, that is, constructing palatable fantasies that shield us from confronting the harsh realities about dominance, abuse, and brutality in our nation's past.
Emily D. West was genuinely heroic, not a romanticized seductress, but as a free Black woman who survived capture, forced displacement, and the chaos of war, and, as far as we know, was able to return to her home.
Furthermore, studying how these myths are built and maintained helps us recognize similar patterns going on today. The same impulses that led 1960s writers to create the Yellow Rose story still affect how we tell stories about race, gender, and American history. Learning to distinguish between documented facts and appealing fiction develops the critical thinking skills we need to evaluate the narratives that are all around us. Thank you for listening.
That was genuinely very interesting. I did not know any of that.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And I love a story about a weird history, sort of like factoid that just becomes embedded in the sort of fabric of a story.
Yeah, it's
even though it has like no reality.
Right. It's like George Washington and the cherry tree, or,
right.
I don't know, what's something else.
I mean, there's so many of these examples where where you go to like write something, even in like our book, right? Like when I went to like write that section about the Fox sisters and their recantation and how much money they were paid, and you're like, okay, well, this person cites this person, and this person cites that person, and that person cites that person, and you like follow the rabbit hole down, and you're like, but where
does it come from?
Is this actually?
Yeah.
I mean, I just love stories like that because I think there is so much of that around.
Yes,
and you just never know.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was fun to write. This literally did happen the way I said, right? Like we were at the Alamo, they had this statue. Like, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. let me do some research. So I'm actually very intrigued. I mean,
that's really, really interesting.
There's obviously a lot more to be done. I mean, I've just kind of scratched the surface looking at secondary sources. I did, go on Family Search a little bit, like seeing like, could I find Emily somewhere in New York and Connecticut? And I did find some, but I don't think they were her. And this was just like very superficial searching, not like big searching. There are, I have some of the digitized records that we have of Emily West. Her signature on her labor contract is digitized.
Yeah.
The petition for her passport back to New York. So those things do exist. And, hopefully myself or somebody else finds some more documentation so we can hopefully know what happened to her after that petition for the passport. I'm going to hope and pray that she was able to live out a prosperous life. That is my hope for her.
I hope so as well.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. As always, we invite you to follow us on Blue Sky and Instagram at dig_history. If you have a comment or a question, or you want to share some kind words with us, you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org. We love listener mail. If you have grumpy words to share with us, consider just keeping them to yourself. Yeah. If you're an educator, we've got a compendium of episodes that you can use in the classroom, including free teaching resources, full lesson plans. They all live on our website, digpodcast.org. You will also find full bibliographies, the scripts for all of our episodes, further resources, and a link to our swag store, all at digpodcast.org. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
This podcast was produced by the historians of Dig, Elizabeth Garner Mazurek, Sarah Hanley Cousins, Marissa Rhodes, and me, Avril Earl. Thanks for listening.
Charging the Mexican camp in what came to be known as the Battle of San Jacinto. San Jacinto is correct, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's technically Jacinto. Right,
Jacinto?
but everybody says it Jacinto, so just say Jacinto.
Unless he or she. Sorry, my eyes are going cross-eyed there.
She supposedly
Including the well-off Emily de Zaval. Including. Oh my god.
mentioned Ballard's. Bleh.
The Mexican national period in the Tejas rate. Oh my god.
Clark argue. Bleh. Sorry, something about Clark and argues together.
Blah. It's part of my problem is like the mic is directly in front of my eyeballs,
So you can't see.
and so I have to. Yeah, I like have to read through the mic, and it makes my like eyes not work. Okay. Oh boy. That's really something. I am a 41-year-old historian of the 19th century, and I did not know that those were the original lyrics of the Yellow Rose of Texas. Oh boy. Okay.
Named Jack.
That's crazy.